Can you use panels in a 3-yard quilt? Let's find out. Hi, it's Hannah with Fabric Café, and welcome to What Quilting Taught Me. This is a series where I show you quilts that I have made, how I broke the rules or how I maybe tweaked the patterns a little, and I share any mistakes that I made along the way and how I fixed those. Today, we're gonna look at how I used panels in a 3-yard quilt. So let's get started. This is our Heartland pattern, and it's from the book Pretty Darn Quick. I chose this pattern primarily because it fit my panel blocks. When you're looking at a pattern for your panels, you want to make sure that the block is the same size or smaller than your blocks. And you want to make sure you're not going to be cutting anything important to make it fit. I have a story about that, so I'm going to tell you about that in a minute. I also really liked that it had kind of this homey feel with this secondary block because I felt like my panel was a little more traditional. So I wanted a more traditional feel, and it has a nice movement here while making it feel homey. I also really liked this sashing that we have right here, framing our blocks, because it really sets it apart and highlights that panel. I also used another fabric in my center, which you will notice. And the reason is I only had so many different panel blocks and I didn't want to duplicate anything. That's just personal preference. So I used a secondary focus fabric. And it also let me put it on my nice big border. I want to give you a visual comparison to what I did with my 3-yard quilt and what it looks like with just 3 yards of fabric, because it looks amazing both ways. So we've pulled together this kit. It's available at fabriccafe.com. And we went a different colorway than this one, but still very earthy, natural, gets you outdoors kind of feel. So we have this great tree fabric with these nice winter trees, nice cool blues. This is going to go everywhere you see these panels, and this green leaf fabric. Our number 2 is this nice textured white, almost like little snowballs, snow puffs. That's going to go everywhere you see this cream. And then we have our number 3, which is our dark blue. And I love this one. It almost looks like snowfall, like looking through the trees and you see all the snow floating down. And it really reflects some of these darker trees, and the little specks of light blue kind of pick up that background in lighter trees. This is going to go everywhere you see this brown. And you can see it looks really, really nice. And notice that those trees are directional, and that works just fine with this pattern. You can use directional fabric, no worries, in that number 1 position. And I love the way that that blue really frames off the trees, and it lets them be their own statement piece. And there's a lot of contrast between that number 2 and that number 3, so you can really see that shoe fly block, which is beautiful. So you can see on mine, I have different things in every block, except for the sprinkling of that green leaf on a few of them to kind of balance it out. I also used that green on the border where you normally would have your focus fabric, but that was hard to do with a panel, so I used that green, and I think it turned out just perfect. Now, I was making this quilt for my dad, and I saw this panel and I just really thought that it worked well for him, that he would enjoy this. So I started with that first, and then I wanted to pick my pattern before I picked companion fabrics. In my head, it worked better because depending on what type of pattern I used, it would determine what kind of matchers I needed, where I needed the most contrast, and what I needed to support the fabric the most. First, you have to determine what the size of your panel is. So I just took a square ruler. Square rulers are the best. And I just measured out how big my panel was. Now, a word of warning with panels, they're not usually printed perfectly straight, but it's okay because you're gonna trim it down, so it doesn't really matter. And I can see through my clear ruler what the biggest size I can cut and what the smallest size I can cut without losing too much of the words in the center and this pretty border. And that's something you want to think about too. You got to look at the block and decide how much are you comfortable losing? How much do you want to cut down without losing the integrity of the block? And that's just personal preference. You pick what's important to you about it. So I checked out what my biggest size was, and I was like, all right, what's my smallest size? Let's look through my pattern books. And I just sat on the floor and I flipped through all my books until I found patterns that had the right size. made a stack of all the books that had those sizes in it. And then when I was done looking through all my books, I went back through and made my final decision of which one I wanted to use. Heartland won out because I liked the aesthetic. I thought it matched this fabric vibe. So after you do that, you need to figure out what your companion pieces are. I chose this cream for my number 2. And you can see I have very little left that has some little practice stitches on it. I really liked how this matched up with my panel. It kind of picks up these taupey colors, and it has kind of soft light brown touches in there, and it keeps it really warm because I wanted the quilt to be really warm and cozy. So this is actually a scrap that I had. I had just enough to make all of these little bits. So normally, this fabric, your number 2 fabric, is also used for your binding. But since I didn't have enough to do that, I got creative and I got a little bit extra of my number 3 fabric. And I used this on my binding instead. So for my number 3, I picked this brown fabric. And I was inspired by the border of my panels. I liked this warm, rich brown and how it picks up all of the words. Many of the words were in brown, and we've got all these leaves. And I thought, that's really pretty. I like the way it frames that. So I decided to go and get a kind of chocolatey brown. And that's really useful when you're using a panel. Sometimes they're just on white and you might not want that, but other times they might come on a specific color. And that might give you a little bit of insight on what color you want to pick up to use as some companion fabrics. I used it everywhere in the pattern that it calls for, as well as on my binding right here. I often use a darker color on my binding because I like how it frames it out, kind of like a picture frame. So I'll often change it if it does call for a lighter color, just because that's my preference. Let's talk about my secondary focus fabric. I only had so many different panels. Since these were all specific words, I didn't want to have any duplicate words. I decided to go with this green leaf. And so you can see it picks up these leaves on all of my panels, keeps with the theme, keeps with that earthy, and it picks up these greens. You see, I could have picked up these yellows, or I could have picked up some of these more purpley colors, but I thought the green would keep it more neutral and soothing. So I used this for my secondary focus fabric. And I just looked at how many I was gonna need after I used all of my panel blocks. Because this pattern also calls for our focus fabric to be on our border, this gave me a great way to use this fabric on my border as well. So I already knew I was gonna need something for this because I didn't have enough from my panel. And it worked out perfectly. I think it looks nice having this frame of the leaf with it little speckles inside the quilts. Let's talk about how to cut out your panels. What I would recommend is first cutting a long strip between them. Usually they're in rows like this. You might have to fold out your whole panel to make sure that you're getting a nice cut between them. After I've cut my long strip, as you can see, these are my remnants, then I like to turn them sideways. You can always cut between them if you want as well, but I found that this worked just fine. And I need to trim it down. So I need to trim mine 1/2 inch to fit into my block. But I want it to be symmetrical. I want the words to be in the center. So what I'm gonna do is I'm going to trim 1/4 off of each side so that it evens out and I'm not like, losing it too much on either side. Just take your square. I'm gonna line it up to that 1/4 inch. You just slice it off. And then I'm gonna move this off to the side just to ensure I don't do anything funny. And then you cut the top off. Now I do that funny, someone noticed that in the last video. You're gonna rotate your block so that you can get the other side just like you just did. So you can see I still have my brown. I do it backwards when I'm trimming the top. I can't really tell you why I do that. It's just something I do. I think I did it one time because I ran out of space. Okay, and I need to flip it one more time so I can get this top down. I think I just didn't have enough space one time, and so that's why I started cutting kind of like backwards. For some reason, it just seems convenient to me. All right, and there you go. You got your panel block all cut out. Now, I want to give you a little word of warning. So this one works just fine, right? You can see I have my whole word. It's going to look great. Double check all of your panels before you start cutting to make sure that all of them work. I got to one block and I realized that when I cut it down, I was going to lose my word because I was going to get half, my seam allowance on here. And so I was going to end up with even less, and I was going to end up with eighthfulness instead of faithfulness. I didn't really want that. Luckily, I had duplicates, so I had another faithfulness block. I was like, okay, I got to figure out how I need to cut this. So what I did is I looked at how big I needed this block to be. And then I looked at what my final block size needed to be so I could see what I needed to cut my borders down to, my brown strips. And then I took those numbers and I went to Blake and I said, I have a 1/2 inch seam allowance and I need my block to be this and I need this to be this. How big do I need to cut these strips? And he told me how big I needed to cut my fabric strips. Now, for those of you who don't know, Blake is my boyfriend. And for others out there, if you don't have a Blake or you're not mathematically inclined, I have another way that you could do it that I actually think is easier. Cut your block the size that you need, then cut your strips like normal that you would be sewing to the sides of it, and just sew it like normal, and then trim it down after the fact to whatever your final block size is. Then you don't have to worry about math. You don't have to think, but what about my seam allowance? How am I going to get it to the right size? It takes all of that out of the equation. You don't have to worry about it. Lots of people are mathematically inclined, so it will come easy to them. I'm not. So that's why Blake always answers my quilting math questions. And it turned out fine having that smaller border. I'm going to show you on the quilt what it looks like, where you can see the whole word is there. And then my side borders are just a little bit skinnier. You can see on this one, they're thicker over here, but it really doesn't make that much of a difference in the quilts. You can still get that same nice framing. It still keeps the same aesthetic. I just tucked it down to the corner, the bottom corner, so that it was a little less noticeable, which is a great place to hide your little mistakes. People look at the top and they don't get to the bottom all the time, so hide them down there. Let's talk a little bit about quilt construction. Now that we've gone over how to cut our panels, let's talk about how we're gonna make these blocks and how we have to change it just slightly. So normally when you're making this pattern, we do strip piecing. And that's where you sew long pieces edge to edge on the long side, and then you're gonna cut your units off. And then you would sew on long strips to both sides, press that and trim it. You can't do that with a panel because you don't have long strips to do. Very easy workaround. So I'm just gonna take my panel block, and then you're just gonna sew a strip to the top and then a strip to the bottom, press it, trim it, then you're gonna go and sew them on both sides. Cut the same amount of strips that you would normally cut when you're doing your strip assembly, and you're just gonna use them like this instead. It also gives you more freedom to use things like panels or layer cakes or charm packs, so you can get really creative with it. If you're not interested in using this kind of method, you think, oh, that looks like too much work, then another way you can use your panels, find a pattern where the block is cut independently, not a part of a strip assembly, and things are just sewn together like that. And then you don't have to worry about getting around a strip assembly. All right, let's talk about our secondary block. And our secondary block is a shoe fly block. And this is something that includes half square triangles. Now, fun fact, this is actually my first quilt I ever made that had half square triangles. I was always a little bit intimidated by them. I thought they were gonna be really super hard and I wasn't gonna enjoy them. But it turns out I actually really enjoy making half square triangles. I am gonna show a little bit of a hack that I do to make my half square triangles. I apologize for any quilters out there who are screaming at me like, no, don't do it that way. But it's what works for me, so I'm gonna show some of those other people out there. If you're struggling, maybe try this. You have your half square triangle squares. First, you just cut a little square. And what you're gonna do is you're gonna mark on the wrong side of typically your fabric 2, whatever is the lightest, so you can see a line right down the middle. We have these really cool markers on our website under our notions that are completely washable. So you can stick it in the washer whenever you're done with your quilt and it'll all go away, but it's really bright so you can see it while you're working. And I'm just going to line my ruler right at the corner for each one. And I'm going to draw a line. Whoop. Now, normally from here, you would put right sides together and you would sew a scant 1/4 inch on either side of this line. I have a really hard time doing that without any additional guidance. I can't sew a straight seam without a little bit of help. So this is what I do. I take my square and I'm going to put the 1/4 inch line right on that line that I just drew down the center of the block. And I'm gonna draw a second line on each side. So I have it on this side, then I'm gonna flip it, put my 1/4 inch on my line, and draw it on the other side. So this gives me a guide. And normally when I'm doing these, I'll do them all at once and I'll lay out several on the table and that way I can go here, draw my first line, just move it over, draw my second line, then I'll go down the line, do that for all of them. And then I can just whoop and rotate all of them so that I can hit that second side for all of them. When I sew it, I sew just on the inside of that line. Now I know it's still a little crooked, but it's fine. No one's gonna see that except my long arm and she keeps my secret, so it's fine. And I sewed with a black thread on this white fabric so you could really see what I do. And that gives me a nice guide so that I can get my straight seam and I'm closer to what I need to be with my size. Next step, after you've got it sewn, you're gonna cut it apart on that first line that you did that was right from corner to corner. Oops. And then you have your 2 half square triangles. So I'd press my seam open, as you can see here, and then I'm gonna trim it down. I like to line this diagonal line up on the diagonal of my half square triangle. It helps me get a little bit more accurate. And I'm going to line it up, not quite exactly what my final block needs to be, but just before that so that I have a little bit more room to trim on the other side. And then gonna trim kind of like we did our panels earlier. You don't have to do backwards, but maybe give it a try. Let me know if you like it. And then you're gonna flip it so that your little dog ears are at the top corner. Put your diagonal line on that line. And this time I'm gonna go exactly where I need it to be. And then you trim it again. Ta-da! And then you have a half square triangle. Half square triangles are really fun, and I've never had any issues getting my half square triangles down to the right size after using that hack that I used where I draw additional lines. So if you are struggling with yours a little bit, this might be something that would help you. So give it a shot and see if you like it. Now that we have all of our blocks made, it's time to assemble our rows. I highly recommend laying out all of your blocks before you start doing this. I do this no matter what quilt I'm making, whether it's just a standard 3-yard with 3 yards of fabric or whether I'm mixing it up. This just gives you an opportunity to see, do I have all my blocks turned the correct direction? Are there any last little minute things that I would like to tweak? It's especially important when you are changing up your fabrics. You know, I have this fabric in my secondary focus block and I have all of my words, which I've got 3 different colors in my words. We've got my green, my yellow, and my purpley color. And I wanted it to be evenly dispersed amongst the quilt. So laying it out gives you the opportunity to see, do I want this one up here or do I want to maybe swap those and move it around? Oh, I don't want these 2 purples next to each other. I want these farther. After you figure out your final placements, take a picture. This is your roadmap for the rest of your quilt, finishing it out and sewing those rows together. This part my cats always like to join me during, and I'm often taking a row and putting it on the table, and I turn around and there's a cat laying on top of my quilt. They like to help me make quilts. I sent my quilt out to be quilted by a long arm. I used Lucinda Cox. She's one of the long arms that we use here at Fabric Café. You can find out more about her at yellowrosequiltandstitch.com. What she does is she sends 3 different designs for me to look at, always with a contrasting color with the design so that I can see it, overlaid onto my quilt. And then we'll talk thread color after that. I told her I wanted to stick with something more earthy and natural to reflect the theme of the quilt. First, she sent me one called Ground Cover. The second one she sent me was this really cool kind of rock design. It's called Malachite. And then the third one was something called Open Leaves. And this was a different leaf one, and it was just a little bit softer than the other one. I still was a little bit worried about it being too contrasting though, or like too conflicting with my words. I asked her if we could make the scale a little bit bigger, and she said yes. You can see that it has just a little bit more space. The leaves are a little bit more open. It really lets the words have more freedom and showcase them more. I went for that one. I thought that looked really nice, and you can see on here we've got our nice big leaves. And we decided on a gray thread, a light gray. And we did this because I didn't know what thread I wanted to use. I was worried about, again, like I said, covering up those words and doing something that it called the focus to that. I wanted my quilting to complement, not command this quilt. And so she suggested light gray. You can see that it is noticeable. You see the beautiful leaf design, but it just complements this, and it's not so overpowering that you can't see the detail in these panels. Let's take a look at what she did on the back. So she did use a slightly different color. She used a little bit darker because my backing was darker. And I think that turned out so nice. It's kind of like a dark gray brown, and it picks up some of these darker colors in the backing. I used this wood grain for my backing because I wanted to keep it more natural, more earthy, and I liked that richness that the brown offered, and I kind of saw that as a through line throughout the whole quilt. I also made a pillow to go along with this quilt for my dad. So I had a bunch of fabric left over, and I thought, this would be a good little companion piece. I took the Heartland pattern, but I did have to tweak it just slightly because I didn't have enough of this fabric number 2. So I took that Heartland pattern and I just shrunk the blocks down a little bit so I had what I needed. And then you can see I added some panel along the border because I wanted some pop of color. I wanted to have that reflection. I didn't want to have words, duplicate words back in the pillow, but I wanted to have those colors included. So what I did is I took a long strip from my panel. You can see, I cut right down the side, sewed them end to end, and sewed my borders along all of these blocks. I highly recommend when you're doing these things, draw a picture, make a note. It doesn't matter if you are a good artist or not. This is strictly for you while you're planning your process. So this is my little note. I always write out what I'm going to be doing so that I don't get confused. It's also a great way for you to not hold all that stuff up in your brain, and it lets you put it out on paper, get it out of there so that you can focus on the sewing and making sure that you're just having fun. I drew out what I wanted where, and then I did all my measurements and stuff there too since I had to change things around. I recommend keeping a little notebook or journal next to your sewing desk. This is mine, and it's chock full of different things, and I love it. I would not be able to sew without my notebook. I also highly recommend this handout on our website. You can find it under free goodies at fabriccafe.com. It is a guide on making a square pillow cover. I use this every time I make a pillow because it gives the instructions on what backing size you need depending on what your pillow top size is. It also tells you what size pillow insert you need to get for that. I love this chart. It's amazing. Pillows are really fun because You just get to pick what design you want featured on it. They can be big, they can be small, and then you can change it out for the season or change it out for whatever quilt is being displayed or give them as gifts. So I wanted to take a minute and share a quilt that one of you guys made. Lilino, or Lilinoy, I'm so sorry if I'm pronouncing your name incorrectly, sent us in this beautiful picture of elation that she did. So let's take a look at that. You can see that she used panels for her #1 fabric, which is where that big block is. This is such a good choice for using panels because those blocks are cut independently. So you just sew your pieces onto the side and it turns out so gorgeous. I also love the fabrics #2 and 3 that she picked. They're very soft and soothing and also have this really nice elegance to them. She did a great job. Thank you so much for sending that picture in. I know I've seen some of your quilts before because you sent in some Halloween ones, and I'm a Halloween girl, so I always love seeing those. If you would like to have your quilt featured, then send them to welisten@fabriccafe.com. Thank you so much for sharing all of your quilts with us. I get a lot of inspiration from the things you send in, so thank you. If you would like to make your own Heartland quilt, don't forget about that kit that I showed you at the top. This kit and even more new ones are available at fabriccafe.com, but quantities are limited, so hurry on over there. This pattern is from the Pretty Darn Quick book, and it's also available as an individual. If you would like to see how to make a quilt from fabric scraps, then be sure and check out the video that pops up. It's Hannah with Fabric Cafe. Happy quilting!